So, sometimes you get a question from patrons, and it's a question which, frankly, you're not really, in my case, ever the teacher of. In that, whilst I'm a student of this topic, and I do study this quite often, I don't usually get to teach it, because usually it is a little bit philosophical and esoteric even for me in the teaching of it. So I'm going to apologise now, because sometimes when it comes to topics like that, I look on YouTube and I see if there's any other people produce very good videos about it, and if they have, then I just don't put it into the vote. I presume others have done it better and can do it better, but I couldn't really find anyone who's done a video about the culture and cultural drivers impact national militaries. And the reason I find it a bit strange is because, to me, it's kind of obvious how things will affect your organisation. I.e., if you're talking about a nation which is mountainous, hilly terrain, is usually, starts off with maybe limited infrastructure, limited population, might be an infantry-heavy formation, because let's be honest, they can more likely sustain and utilise infantry for their operational needs. An island nation is more likely to have quite a well-developed navy and air force today, because, well, kind of critical to their strategic needs. And we're going to be talking through this whole thing with reference to certain nations which I have more familiarity with, to give as examples. And broadly speaking, I translate how national drivers affect and impact national militaries into history and geography effect things. Who would have thought it? This is probably the problem for me. For me, this topic is very much a case of, well, obvious. And I have been told about that in the past. I have been told that that's one of the reasons why I have why I don't teach it. Because to me it seems obvious. And I think, well, to an extent that's probably because of the time I spent studying militaries and history. It just seems so intuitive, so natural that such things will happen in such circumstances. It is not something I consider that almost needs to be taught. But I still am a student of it. I'm still always interested in the books I read about them. I do find some of the reasoning that goes into some of the works on this particular topic to be convoluted in the extreme. So I will try to avoid that. I'm not going to say how long this video is going to be. I don't know, I'm just starting it off. But I'm going to go through the core points and the core areas and hopefully give you something to go and base your own analysis on. But as said, it is rather logical, it's rather sensible, and it can come down to such things as how long has the nation been going as a nation? How long has the nation been in the form it is? These things can have an impact, and they often can have a very serious impact in terms of it. Now, cultural drivers usually come up when we talk about individuals rather than on a national level. A person can usually change their immediate cultural drivers. Even a company can change its cultural driver. But countries take a very long time to change. For an individual, we might talk about health, relationships, education, religion, societal norms, organisation, motivation, interests, experience, and history. That's what we're talking about as an individual. We're talking about a normal human being, and we're talking about their individual cultural drivers. Now, normally, I start to teach this sort of stuff when I'm starting to teach psychological warfare. And how you break a country down. And usually the first thing is you start to use the things that can bring a country together to divide it up. If a country's a melting pot of different groups which get along, you use those groups to break it up. You set it down so they're breaking themselves up into ever smaller and smaller groups. so they're always fighting, so that everyone's always alone, that no one groups together. Because whilst humans have always been individuals, humans have also always formed groups. They've always formed organizations naturally. We have not necessarily a herd mentality. I think that's sometimes the wrong phraseology, but we have a gathering mentality, is how I tend to prefer to use it. Herd mentality says we tend to go along as a group, like sheep. Or sort of one bounces in direction, all the rest sort of start bouncing in that direction after them. A gathering mentality means that where some start to go, others tend to look and decide whether they're interested in that or not. So a herd mentality means you follow where others go. A gathering mentality means you've got options and you choose which place you gather. It's kind of like herding, but it's slightly different. It's just different enough to make sense to me. It's always appealed more to me as a phraseology than herding. Health, well, health for an individual versus a national health is a very different thing. There's lots of people who talk out metrics of health for a nation. Honestly, again, when we're talking about procurement, we're talking about systems and armed forces, and we're talking over a spectrum of how they're going to be formed and affected over 100, 200 years. The aging population thing, it becomes a factor, but health of the population as all, you can make people healthier, you can ease up on it and they'll become less healthy. Usually that's food regulations, that's kind of things to do with how popular exercise is. One of the interesting factors I recently saw was that in some countries they're trying out various schemes with gyms, because if they make gym membership not free, interesting enough, and I'll explain that why in a second, they reduce the price of gym membership. People then turn gyms into their part of their social life, into their social gathering space, and because it becomes a social space and they're exercising as well, that's a good thing, and it brings people together in a healthy way. And you sort of try and move people to be socializing in gyms rather than, let's say, pubs, etc., because one is theoretically healthier for you than the other. Theoretically. But the thing is, why not make that free? Because again, this is the gathering mentality of humans, and humans are distrustful of free things. They often think free stuff is either a con of them or a con of you. And if it's free, they don't value it. Whereas if it has a value, even if it's a cheap value, you think, oh, that's value for money. You won't think, oh, why is that free? So actually, you want there to be a price. There to be a price associated with something. Maybe not much, but something. Relationships. I do ascribe to the view that countries don't have relationships, they have interests. When it comes down to brass tacks, that's what they have. They don't have relationships, they have interests. I'm sorry. Humans have relationships, individuals have relationships. I'm speaking to you through YouTube. This could if you're one of my subscribers who watches my videos regularly, we could be described as having a parasocial relationship. I do realise from some of the comments I get from people, they do feel like I should know them very well, and they know me very well. And sometimes that's an interesting one for me to deal with, because I'm sort of going, well, I'm sorry, I don't actually know you. You have spent hours watching me and occasionally chatting in the chat, perhaps. But in terms of relationship going back, I haven't spent hours watching you. If we compare that to, let's say, my relationship with Clarke, or Dr. Dan, or the others, I go away with them on ship-shape trips for months at a time with the ship-shape group. We're away together for a month in a foreign country. We have a great fun time. But that's one of the reasons why we have the friendship we do have, because as well as being friends and talking, we spend a lot of time together. They are the people who will call me if they have a problem, and they are the people I will call if I have a problem. But relationships, that's something. If you're trying to analyze someone, if you're looking for someone to maybe for intelligence reasons or something, and you want someone you can easily manipulate, you're usually looking for someone with minimal social relationships. You're looking for someone who's pretty much on their own. They are usually the most easy to manipulate because they don't have touchstones to evaluate things by. That sounds terrible to say, but it's true. But there again, that also then applies to countries. If you want to manipulate a country which is isolationist, which has minimal interactions with the rest of the world, it's often most easy to manipulate. So think about that. Pariah states, etc., those things. This is why it's one of the good things is actually reaching out to pariah states and trying to interact with them. It can improve relationships. But it's never going to be but it's always going to be a difficult thing, because it's how do they take the relationship. You can reach out, but what comes from it, beneficial or not, will depend on how they react to it. And you have to be prepared to A, have your fingers burned, and B, withdraw that relationship. Because again, nation states are weird. They are a collective of humans. They are both an individuals in terms of their leadership, and a collective in terms of a national politics. It's weird. Education. Now this is one of the fun things. I think I was probably taught more at school, in my primary school, about gun safety. And I went to a pretty normal, but I do admit, I was a scholarship boy to a private school, primary school, in the UK. I was taught more about gun safety than my cousins who went to primary school in Texas. At school. I was taught about it by my grandparents, my granddad especially, and my mother as well, who were all excellent shots. But I was taught a lot about it at school. That's not normal for the UK, I do admit. But it always surprised me, is we have theoretically tougher rules in this country than some other nations, and yet at primary school I was being taught how to use a gun, how to clear a gun, how to check a gun, how to check its safety, all those things. And yet in nations which have more access to guns, they weren't taught that. I was taught, how to be very, very careful about a gun, to give it proper respect, proper care. The same with swords. I was also taught fencing, but hey-ho, it was great exercise. And societal norms. Now, the interesting thing is, an individual can be someone who bucks societal norms or who goes along with them, or someone who, and this is the most fun sometimes, maliciously over-complies with societal norms. I have one of those. Whenever I'm going off on my fitness walks, which I have to do for recovering from pneumonia, or I'm walking a dog, I say good morning or afternoon to everyone I pass. Everyone. Dogs and humans. Now, societal norm in the UK is we acknowledge people as we go past. That's always been the tradition. Maybe a nod, maybe a hello. But I say afternoon. I am overly friendly. Why? Because honestly, it's a little psych warfare experiment. I like to see how the people react. It gives me a good measure of whether they are going to be they're friendly people, whether they are a bit strange. By being a little bit funny myself, I can get an assessment of them. It allows me to do a threat assessment. A limited one, but enough for walking past them. But that is malicious compliance with societal norms. Organisation. Ooh, yeah. What kind of company do they work for? What kind of community are they in? What kind of structures do they like to get involved in? What's their position in those companies? Are they leadership? Are they worker bees? What are they? All these things can attack that. Then we got their motivations. Ooh. Motivations, organizations, again, with countries, kind of what kind of organization is the country? Is it a monocracy? Is it a republic? Is it democracy? What is it? And motivation, why are they getting involved in this? Why are people involved in the things they do? Why do they do the things they do? That works for both. Interests. Well, as an individual, your interests might include computer games, history, might include iron brew. All good things to have interest in. I highly recommend them all. But for a nation state, interests often mean, where do their sea lines of communication go? What do they net import? What do they net export? What is their crucial defensive perimeter? Experience in history. Well, that's a fun one. The trick of that one is to usually look around the world and find out what the Second World War is called. It's always a fun thing when people realise the Second World War is not called the Second World War in all countries. It's called different things. World War II is not called World War II in different countries. And that gives you a different phraseology of the war. Because if it's not the Second World War, if it's something else, that can give it a whole different connotation. For example, Russia, the Great Patriotic War. The Great Patriotic War. Think about that. It immediately makes it a rather personal thing, not a world war. It's not something which we were all involved in. It's our patriotic war. It's our great war, and it explains to an extent probably how often a Russia can use it to rewrite history should they need to. Russian leadership can use it to rewrite history. Because once it's already phrased as a great patriotic war, where it's all centered around Russia, it's very easy to build that as a narrative. Whereas the narrative in the UK or America, World War, it's far more difficult to build that narrative as just being about you alone. I know many do try. I have seen Hollywood's productions over the last few years. But the thing is, it's very difficult to, once it's framed as a world war. But these are individual things. When we're talking about most of this stuff in terms of how it applies to nation states, we're talking about what I would call history and geography. And that's both human geography and physical geography. That is what are the drivers which then impact on the culture and on the formations of their armed forces. So, that is what we are focusing on. We are focusing on the history and geography effect things. There you go. So, here's a fun thing. If you're an island nation or a continental nation, this can change your approach to how your forces are structured and what you're going to emphasize, what you're going to focus on. So this is a starting point which is always pretty effective to go. Are you an island or a continental nation? Now, there are nations like America which are special. i.e., they are pretty much an island nation once you consider their actual geographic circumstances and the fact that their northern border is a fairly decent ally and not much of a military threat to them even if they weren't, due to population and economic differentials, and their southern border is pretty much the same. There are issues, though, on both borders for various different reasons, and there are still issues when it comes to, how to put it, policing, especially on both borders. But in terms of militarily, the actual, do we need to go and fight a war over this sort of thing? The borders have had a history of conflict, but they haven't had anything in a very long time. It's definitely police actions all round now. Probably not anything else. So, in that regard, America sometimes counts as an island nation. For other nations, if they are island nations, it makes a very simple scenario of where is their defensive depth. Their defensive depth is the sea. If you are Japan and you're considering what is your defensive depth that you would prefer to fight a battle in, rather than fighting a battle in your territory, it's going to be the sea. It's the same with Britain. If Britain has to choose where to fight a battle, the Battle of Britain, they want to fight it over the English Channel, over the North Sea. They don't want to fight it over the skies of England. That's the choices. They would prefer it to be over water. And if you're nations like Germany and Russia, well, you've got humongous land borders, but you've also got sea borders. You need to think about those. And the thing is, all nations, it doesn't really matter whether you're a continental nation or an island nation, are going to have sea lines of communication for trade. Because 97% of all trade by volume, 90% of all trade by value, and those are by the statistics which were from paper produced about 3 years ago, travels by sea, and have historically travelled by sea. When we're talking about moving goods, especially large amounts of heavy goods, they are moved by sea. The container ships are... Well, the closest thing container ships come to in terms of your normal individual life, it's a bus route. The container ships are buses going round and round and round, dropping off passengers, picking up passengers at every stop. They are bus routes. When we think about oil tankers, we think about liquefied natural gas carriers, even the modern ones, all those things, they are closer to taxis. Or maybe airport shuttles. They're going between one place and another, and it's a constant stream. And if you get high enough above the world, or you watch the various shipping apps, and you just indicate tankers, you can just see those never-ending ribbons of tankers going out around the world to the various ports. You can just watch them travel around the world. It's fun. That's the sinews of wealth going around the world. This has an effect on a nation. If it is an island nation, if it is dependent upon global trade, it's going to emphasise naval power. If you consider Britain, to an extent, the Navy came first. The Navy was the senior service. The Navy has been treated through much of its history as the number one. And even to this day, it's a rather interesting scenario. If you talk to people in the UK, and recent survey was done, was if you have them buying a foreign design for an armoured vehicle for the army, acceptable. Buying a foreign design for the navy, that causes issues. It caused issues with tankers. It's one of the reasons why the Type 31 program, which is an either Hoodfelt design, modified, was reworked, renamed, rebranded, and so much emphasis was made on branding it and made it being built in the UK and all these things to emphasise its UK-ness. Even then, there were issues. Japan has a slightly more complicated history, probably because for them, for quite a lot of their history, naval power was an ancillary capability. They had it. It was part of the power structures, but it was mostly used as a movement tool, as a tool of strategic manoeuvre and tactical manoeuvre to an extent, not as a combat power tool in and of itself. To an extent, that reflects the isolationism they had as part of their history at certain points, and the way they shut themselves down from the world. In an important period where it could have become quite a major naval power. Now, this means that for them, and Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force theoretically isn't senior to the other services. But in practice, again, due to the fact that the sea is quite definitely Japan's preferred area of engagement, it's their preferred zone of strategic depth, by de facto, it has become quite an important part of their structure, which would explain why Japan today has quite such a strong maritime self-defense force. In contrast, Britain, which for most of its history, Navy was the key part of it, then joined an alliance called NATO, and during the Cold War, the big thing in NATO was to have armies in Germany, was to have a force structure in Germany. And so the army became the primary part of the British forces, the focus of the funding. And that's why we've ended up with a navy which is quite so small today in comparison with the Japanese navy, and an army which has now been shrunk ever since the end of the Cold War, and that commitment's gone, and the British forces look kind of out of balance with their national needs. You'd expect, with Britain with the scenario it's in, to have a solid army with a larger core of reservists built around it for when it needs to be mobilised in a major war, but have very strong, comparatively to its size, air forces and navies, because the strategic depth for Britain is the North Sea, is the English Channel, and the sea lines of communication, the global trading and specialised. You would expect that to be the format of the forces, realistically, if you're looking at it. To be honest, none of the forces are equipped to be that. And I'd say even the army is not the core of a larger reserve force or anything like that. Because, again, Britain's traditional strength, which it had built up in the World War I, the Boer War era onwards, to pretty much most of the way into the early parts of the Cold War, of having a large reservist force to call upon, a large territorial army, etc., to call upon, was got rid of in the name of the fact that, well, the wars were going to become nuclear powered. That nuclear weapons were going to be used automatically when war began, and so wars would be over in minutes, if not, days, if not minutes. And so, yeah. This is one of the problems you find in different countries. They have different cultural operandos. In Britain, there is often a focus on efficiency, and a perception of efficiency is value for money, and we've done some statistical analysis, and this is what our maths backs us up. And of course it's Britain for whom the phrase, there are lies, damned lies, and statistics comes from. We have that as part of our core phraseology, with the first utterance of it is actually from the UK. First time we find it written down and published, anyway. Well, to me, that strongly suggests we know ourselves that our statistics do not match the reality of our situation. But leave that to one side. For Germany and Russia, sea lines of communication matter. For Russia, they have quite a large sphere of naval operations that they need to conduct. They have lots of different bodies of water they need to be involved in. But they also have a massive land border they need to secure, with many, many potential threats around that border. And so for them, whilst they might wish to fund the Navy, they are always going to be looking for offset strategies for their naval forces, and that is their history. This is why they produced the circular battleship ideas and all sorts of things, to try and produce something which was an offset strategy. Something which they could produce in comparatively small numbers, but could be difficult enough to overwhelm by larger fleets that they would not come and interfere. For Germany, well, we all know the times in history when they've tried to build large navies. Ultimately, those funding for those large navies tends to be curtailed the moment the army needs the funding, because compared to their sea lines of communication, their land borders are colossal. You know, with Russia, if you consider the fact that quite technically the Arctic, is technically oceanic, as it's an ice pack up there rather than a continental mass, you can point out they have a huge amount of sea border. They have a huge amount of coastline, and you would be quite accurate. In comparison, Germany's coastline to the land border, there is a difference going on. There is a difference. So that's island versus continental. It does have an impact on nations and their form of their militaries. And then we start looking at the history. Now this might seem vaguely obvious, but let me explain. History has an impact on the formation of your modern militaries. It really does. You've had revolutionary wars. What impact have they had? One interesting thing from America's perspective is that often some units trace themselves back to the American War of Independence. And they go, yes, this is our history, this is how long we've been here. But when you look at the American military structure, it realistically traces itself more back to the Civil War. And the lesson of, it's better to expend things rather than people. And that's been, if you look from that point onwards, the American military mantra, and what has been structuring the American military from that point onwards is, it is always better to expend things rather than people. They are always happy to use heavy artillery. They are always happy to use new technology, new weapon systems to go and do things so they don't expend people. In fact, you could say the lesson of the America's war, which had the greatest loss of American life, which of course was the Civil War, because it was Americans killing Americans. I know, it's kind of like when I point out to people the greatest loss of British life in any war was, as a percentage of the war losses, was the War of the Three Kingdoms, aka the British Civil War. Okay, this thing. It's the case of when you're killing each other, that will be the greatest loss of life. And that will have the impact. That's left America the legacy of not wanting to lose people they can avoid losing. This is one of the reasons why World War One, and they're rather limited in terms of length of the war involvement in World War One, leaves such a big impact on the American psyche. Because not that long previously, in fact within many living people's lives, they'd fought the Civil War. And they'd seen the bloodshed. And then they have another massive war where they see a lot of carnage and bloodshed, and that leads them down this road. For Britain, interestingly enough, the legacy of its Civil War is slightly more complicated. For Britain, the legacy comes from the New Model Army, and I know there are many royalists who are going to hate me for saying this, but it's true. It does come from the New Model Army. It comes from Cromwell of Fairfax's formation. It's build a small professional elite force and everything else can be added around it. You need a professional elite core of your army that you can expand when you need to and you can keep going. And it's realistically from that point onwards that Britain starts to have a standing army. And Britain moves from levies being raised, from formations being raised ad hoc when they needed to be, etc., and various titular units, to an actual professional standing army. The Navy has the biggest change of all. The Navy had already been professionalised, I would say, to a large degree, before the British Civil War, before the War of the Three Kingdoms. I know we'd like to call it the English Civil War sometimes in history, but I'm not teaching history, but it really isn't. It does involve the Kingdom of Ireland, and it does definitely involve a lot of the Covenanters in Scotland. And in fact, the Covenanters in Scotland rather kind of cause it because of the trouble they're causing. So, realistically, if you just try and call it the English Civil War, it leads out a lot of the other factors in it. It is a war of united kingdoms. It is They might not be united in government, but they are united in state at that point. They are united in state. And soon afterwards they will be united in government, but we'll leave that to one side. Mainly because Scotland decides that instead of competing with the English on religious grounds, they're going to compete them on grounds of imperialism, and going to go bankrupt doing it, but we'll leave that to one side. Oh, that's always a bit of interesting history. Scotland, the nation which lost its independence by going bankrupt, and they're having to, because there was a worry that it might be seized by the nations which owned its debt. They take it into the English under the English crown because it got in debt to foreign nations, and there was a real worry it might be seized by the Danish. It's a fun bit of history. There are others other than the Danish, but they're just ones that come to mind. Oh, it's a fun times history. But both of these nations were heavily impacted by it. And again, when you look around most nations, they will have a structure which is relevant of their history. Especially depending on where the armed forces stood in the war. Okay? If the armed forces were on the side of the revolution, then often they come through relatively unscathed. There is a reason why Spain's military has managed to keep a lot of their traditional units going for a very long time. They keep being on the winning side of the Revolutionary War, when they happen in Spain. One could argue something similar in France when you look at some of their armed forces. How they seem to, since the Napoleonic times, have managed to stay usually on the right side of history. It's an amazingly canny political skill. But in other nations, those militaries get completely destroyed and new militaries come up in their place. A good example was Russia and the Soviet Union, and what we now have for Russia and the armed forces they now have. And there are problems with that. You see, usually, and this is going to sound quite terrible, but let's broadly speaking it. When you're dealing with a force structure like was maintained in Tsarist Russia, for the revolutionary force structure to work, they just had to be slightly better than the other option, which didn't make them very good. Then you have the Stalinistic purges and all the other things which go through, which ends up, especially, and then later on the Khrushchev purges, which were less bloody but still effective, getting rid of all of dissidents. You end up with a military which is very politically engaged, but where politics is more of a key to getting ahead than necessarily competency. This doesn't mean you're incompetent, no. It just means that the people who are getting to the top are not necessarily your most competent soldiers, or sailors or airmen, but are the ones who are competent enough, but are also politically competent enough. I don't expect any of them to be blunt-spoken, hard-fighting warriors. I expect them to be efficient soldiers and effective politicians. And sometimes that even makes them for better strategists. But again, how the Soviet Union, how Russia approaches its analytical strategy and how it engages and analyzes targets is a reflection of its history. But that's also going to have an effect on the structure within the forces, how they approach it. One of the legacies you see from the Soviet Union is the idea that they could invent a new form of human, that communism could create a new human who was beyond things like greed and pettiness and fear, and who didn't have any of the bad points of humanity, any of them. That was the mantra and the propaganda they put out anyway. The thing is, they try consistently, it comes up every time they start talking about their soldiers, every time they start talking about reforming their armed forces, it's always based on the same idea. That they can fundamentally make them something different from humanity. And when they fall short, they're surprised. And this might explain some of the issues they have. If we consider recent operations of Ukraine, and this, please note, this is not a massive analytical thing of the 2022 invasion versus the 2014 operation or anything like that. That's not what this is about. But the point is, the Russians, if you look at their plan, was planned for a quick swoop in and take out their opponents. Their assumption was Ukraine was going to be a weak political structure which was going to collapse under pressure. And the best example of that is the assault they were planning, the airborne assault on Kiev. And the fact is, they had succeeded with these. If you look at some parts in recent years, they've succeeded a lot of times. It's something they've returned to a lot in their history. A rapid descent on the leadership, take out the leadership, render it, take the head, cut the head off the body, and the body crumbles. And they organise their forces around that. The airborne forces are very much an elite. Their forces are organised around that. And when it fails, that's the point at which the Russians really started to have trouble strategically in Ukraine. Because suddenly they had to change modes. They'd been all set up for the rapid assault, rapid decapitation fight, and then it failed. And that's one of the issues they have with the force structure and how they're deploying forces, etc. Their plans would have worked if that part had succeeded. But that has been, since the Civil War, the Russian Civil War, has been a methodology of Russia, or the Soviet Union, to take out the leadership of the state they're fighting as rapidly as possible, take out its political leadership, its political centre, and then it will fall. It's not a bad tactic, not a bad strategy. You pull it off, it works well. But by focusing so often on that, it does kind of leave you predictable. And again, if you look at that particular battle space and what happens, if you look at the units around that area, it does look like the Ukrainians had been preparing for that as a likely scenario. I'm sorry, you don't have that many crack loyal units in that space waiting there if you don't expect someone to do it when people are coming in across your border. You just don't do that. But that's where they were. And I would say for all of them, for the British, the concentration on a small specialist force and calling up only larger forces, in terms of longer term wars, that is also a weakness. It's a strength because it means you always have a very highly trained core to build your army around, which gives you usually a very good proficiency and capability if it's properly funded and properly resourced. But it also means you're always short of troops at the beginning of a conflict. You never have a large enough army at the beginning of a war. Or a large enough navy or air force, for that matter. For the Americans, if you go too far down the technology route, you forget the human geography side of war. And that can be seen in what happens in Vietnam. Realistically, the Americans won the physical geography side of the war. They won the battle side of the war. They lost the human geography side of the war. That's what was lost. If we consider some of the other issues which have affected these operations in recent years, human geography is a big factor. People deride hearts and minds and those sort of phrasings, but realistically, that's human geography. And I'm sorry, it ain't going anywhere. Because I know humans are messy and annoying and get in your way. I know the squidgy organic bits cause trouble in fitting machinery. But they're a core part of it, because we're all human. And that leads us to, well, let's start off with the physical geography, shall we? So here's the weird point for geography. The better the starting position you have in any computer game, the stronger you're going to get and the more likely you go and get more resources. So the nations which are most likely early on, especially in a world which values control of resources to allow you access to resources, that are going to expand the most are going to be those nations which have the best sets of resources themselves, i.e. are in the strongest position to go and hunt for it. This was Britain's advantage. when it came to getting an empire. Britain had the advantages of logistics in an easy infrastructure thanks to its coastline, the relative ease of manoeuvring stuff around the coast and rivers going out to it, which gave it an early advantage before it came to the point of setting up canals, roads, railways as time went on. Let's be honest, the roads during the Roman time were really good, and then roads after that needed a lot of work. We'll leave that to one side. There was some effort. Please do not fall into the trap of thinking the Dark Ages were really that dark, or that the medieval times had no infrastructure investment or no roads being built at all. They did. Roads were built, bridges were maintained, all these things. But realistically, there was not a national plan going on. There was no national strategy. There was, at best, local lords, usually local merchants, advocating for, we need something better to get us from point A to point B. And a lot of developments of point A's to point B's grow into a road network. And sometimes those are just renewal of old roads, renewal of old surfaces which have been set up. But yes, resources, the quality resources you have, the ease of access to them, all are advantages. And it's one of those weird things. It also, again, starts to shape your military. Why do the British have such a history of longbow archery? Because of the trees that grow in Britain. Quite a lot of them. I'm of course talking about yew trees. YEW for those wondering. They're very useful. They're quite plentiful. And to be fair, this is natural resources. It's the same with oak trees. And it's the same with resources accessing to coal, to iron, all those things. You can find fairly good quality, fairly accessible resources quite abundantly across the British Isles. And this is a resource advantage. You add in things like tin, lead, various other ores you can find, and the UK really does have an advantage when it comes to resources. Even today, there's not far from me, there is actually a lithium mine. Not far from where I live, there is a lithium mine. It's one of the largest in Europe, I think. Possibly is the largest in Europe. There's a huge debate. I don't take much notice of some of the papers which come out about it because I realise they're going to be bigging up. But it's certainly large enough that it's going to be a very profitable exercise. And there seems to be a lot of investment going in around it. So I am tempted to believe the finances of it, because the amount of money people are prepared to spend to get access to it. And this is a useful thing. Countries which have access to these resources have the ability to move up. Britain also has access to quite a lot of fertile farming land, which is useful. And most importantly, from a geographical perspective, with all these resources, they're easily defensible. We don't hear much in our history. There isn't much in the history of other nations. Pretty much after 1066, there are a few instances. There's a time with a Louis and various other things we'll leave to one side. But realistically, invasions of the UK are relatively rare and relatively minor, which means, barring the Civil War period, barring the periods of internal strife, you often have long periods of uninterrupted, relatively peaceful development that allows you to exploit these resources, to develop skills in exploiting resources. The skilled workers are not going to be killed off by wars. They're still going to get ravaged by plagues, but everyone gets the plagues. Not everyone has the stability. And that's all part of the geography. Because if you've got the resources, well, there's an old saying in academia. The reason the fights between academics are so bitter is because the money is so small. If you have abundant resources, you have the ability to share, because there's something to share out. If there's very few resources, people fight hard for them because there's not enough to go round. Again, it's one of those things. It's easier to share when there's an abundance than it is when there's a minimal. And it's the same throughout histories of nations. If you have access to resources, you can use them to fuel your growth and fuel your expansion, but also if you don't have access to those resources, you can end up fighting over what you actually have. Or even worse, seeking other advantages elsewhere. That can make you successful, if you are successful. You could be like the Mongols, on all the other steep tribes which descended, created territories, and then others came after them because they were lacking the resources they needed, so they descended looking for resources. But sometimes you might not be that successful. Sometimes you might be very short-lived, or you might run into someone who is organized and prepared and able to withstand you, because they have the resources. And so with that, shameless book plug time. So, shameless book plug. Always a fun point in a video. Always a fun point to discuss. It's where I get to say thank you, and thank you for liking, sharing, subscribing, helping the channel grow. Thank you for doing all that. And yeah, thank you for these patron suggestions. They're fun, they're a challenge. I'll be continuing on from the last slide and explaining how the last slide affects militaries, but it makes more sense if I finish off that explanation on the next slide, so don't worry, that's coming. And yeah, when this comes out, hopefully, because theoretically it should be coming out, and I'm going to clarify this, on the 20th of September. I should be making final preparations. Because hopefully I should be getting on the train in a couple of days from this point to go up to Heathrow, stay the night, get on a plane the next morning to Japan, get out there the day before everyone, and hopefully finish off organising and have everything go to plan. And this is always the scary part, because some things like, let's say, shrines, etc., you have to do negotiations with people to have access to the shrines, and the shrines themselves don't always have email access, and so, in fact, neither of them do. So you have to negotiate through third parties, and you have to hope that the third parties have actually arranged the things they're supposed to have arranged. And that's the scariest thing for me, because so far my track record in these things has been 50-50. They've always arranged something, it's just what they've understood of what I wanted to arrange versus what I actually I thought I was arranging are often very different things, and it's a case of you try to be as clear and as plain in your language as possible, but again, there's translation, and it's fun. It's always a worry, but it's all possible thanks to you. So thank you for all your support, thank you for all your kindness, thank you for helping this channel do everything it's done. With that being said, history. Now, if you have a lot of resources, your temptation might not be to stockpile. It often isn't to stockpile. Whereas if you don't have resources, you often will stockpile resources. Now, what does this make a difference? Well, in the case of Britain, because of its unique situation in Europe, having to fight wars quite regularly, but also having quite abundant resources, and governments which don't like to pay to stockpile stuff quite often, although they do have quite a lot of number of ships in ordinary, which means they're not commissioned, they're just sitting in the Medway or various other places at various other dockyards, ready to be deployed should they need to be, after they've been commissioned. Well, you start to develop a bureaucratic infrastructure that allows you to not stockpile, but to rapidly mobilize using your resources and using your existing infrastructure when war begins. We like to talk in Britain about about the Royal Dockyards and how great they are. People forget about how large the Board of Ordnance was. It's often, in many times of history, has been second only to the Treasury in size and scope, which was often, the Treasury was the largest department in government. And it was around from 1476 till 1855. That's the Board of Ordnance. There were people who provided the guns and the ammunition for the army and the navy. A truly massive organisation. Combined with the Royal Dockyards, they were probably two of the founding points of the modern British state in terms of developing, supporting, sustaining their long-term infrastructure. Was critical to making long-term thinking a practice of the British government. But also they are a problem, because they are the reason why these organisations, historically, British governments have felt they didn't need to prepare in peacetime for war. Because as long as they had that small kernel of professional force to rapidly build around, they had the infrastructure they could build up from. Now, they did this by investing a lot in that infrastructure in peacetime, by investing a lot of capacity into that infrastructure in peacetime. And this is where things get forgotten. Because this worked well in a period where, while governments were not exactly socialist, they did believe in state ownership of certain things. Because who but the state was going to invest in having the capacity for full wartime, even in peacetime when it's not going to be profitable? It was understandable. But this is where you can get into trouble. You see, these organisations that used to be the pride of the British government, the pride of the British Empire when it was around to an extent, which were the cornerstones of its ability to wage war. And let's be honest, the Board of Ordnance might have ceased to exist in 1855, but the organisations which took over from it in 1855 continued on to well after the Second World War, as did the Royal Dockyards. They're all gone now. They're gone because wars were going to be short because of the nuclear age. Because the theory was it's better not to have government-owned industry, because government-owned industry is going to be inherently inefficient. And you're right. They're right. The government-owned industry does tend to be inefficient because it tends to be, especially if it's military industry, structured around maintaining capacity for wartime, even in peacetime, which means it has a lot of bits which it doesn't need in peacetime. But that's the point. The inefficiency is capacity. The capacity is necessary so you have the efficient capability in wartime. It's kind of like when you're building something. Okay? If you want to build an efficient production line, an efficient capability, you might build in some inefficiency into that. You see, if you optimize everything for efficiency the whole way down the production line, and don't have any slack in it, you will often have issues when parts get delayed because there'll be no slack in it. But whereas if you take a production line and you go, right then, well, this part is critical, we can't do anything if we don't have this part, so we should build in an extra stockpile of this part into our storehouse. This part we can get easily from multiple suppliers, so we don't need to have stock. If you look through your parts of production like that, you can build an efficient production line which can keep on producing even when they're under delays to the critical parts you can only get from one source, and if you don't have them, you're going to be in trouble. So if they have a hiccup, you don't catch a cold. And that was the thing. These systems were about that capacity. And this is where you can have your own history, your own cultural drivers actually work against your military strategy, your strategy and organisation, because your traditional strategic organisation is one way, but then you've got new governments, new economic theories, they've got all these ideas and this new concept of war which is going to be very quick because it's going to go nuclear, so suddenly they presume the traditional paradigms don't apply, so they get rid of those traditional bulwarks, those historic bulwarks. Traditional, historic is what they're called, but actually they're kind of learned. bulwarks. They're things which have proved necessary in the past. And once you get rid of them, they are very difficult to build back, because if you want to pay a private company to be inefficient, they're going to charge a lot more than a government-owned organisation, because private companies exist to make a profit for their shareholders and investors. There is nothing wrong with that. But if you have to add on the cost of maintaining extra capacity onto that cost in peacetime, and having it ready, sitting there ready in peacetime for what you might need in wartime, and you have to add a profit margin on top of that for the company to make it viable for the company to do it, that's going to add a premium onto what you'd be paying. So whilst, yes, if you're playing for only the capacity you need at this current time, that is going to be more efficient, and that is why the private model tends to look more private and efficient than the state-owned model. The state-owned model allows you to maintain the inefficiency of extra capacity in peacetime without paying the profit margin. It's an inefficiency that produces an inefficiency when you need it. And again, you can argue, if you have multiple organizations that can sustain it, as Britain did at certain points when they cut these organizations, that you don't need it. You've got multiple sources. And that's a true idea. But when you look at the current infrastructure that's in Britain at this current time, on other Western nations, you start to look back and think, well, it's actually, we are looking more like the Napoleonic eras. And in those eras, because there weren't the multiple options of various private entities to do it, you needed these state models. And it wasn't about socialism or statism. It wasn't about any of those things. It was about sensible preparations. Because if you're not going to stockpile, if you're not going to build up forces to deal with the time it's going to take for the private industry to work up, then the only option which can give you any chance of building up forces when you might need them in wartime is going to be having state industries. If, for example, today, if you were talking about this, if we had a modern ordnance board sitting around, I'm fairly certain they would have the capacity to build up the capacity to build up missiles and build the various missile systems that we use, and rockets and shells and bullets, but also probably be investing in things like expendable drone assets and those production facilities, because that would make sense for such an organization to maintain. Because the amount of expendable drones you need to buy in peacetime is massively lower than the amount you need to buy in wartime. And realistically, at no point in wartime do you want to be competing on the open market with all the other countries also hunting for those things. It's those things of, there are some scenarios, like bridges and infrastructure. You build them with the expectation of future use. So when you're building a bridge, you've got an existing crossing which has one lane each way, and you're going to trouble investing in a new bridge. You look at the road and go, is this an area which is going to get more housing in the future? If it is, then maybe you want to put in a bridge which is 3 lanes wide, or is built wide enough so that it not only has the 2 lanes, it has pedestrian walkways and maybe cycleways on both sides. You build in capacity to deal with the increased traffic which is likely to come. That is what governments are supposed to do. They're supposed to take the 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 year approach, which is unprofitable, which is why governments have to do it. Because it's a risk, but it's also necessary. You prepare for the 50-year scenario. Companies, which are supposed to make a profit, Governments aren't. Companies are. Governments aren't supposed to run at a loss either, but they're not required to make a profit either. Don't have to think like that. And neither do individuals. Individuals, you don't ask them, what is your 50-year plan? Boring historians like me might have a 50-year plan, but that's because we tend to think in centuries. Most people have a 5-10-year plan when you talk to them. Maybe a 20-year plan when they're very much younger, or when they're looking at retirement, at some point. But countries, they have to have a up to 100-year plan, and they have to think it through, because they are going to be there. They might not have the same leadership. They probably won't have the same leadership. They're going through many changes, but they will still need to be there. So they need to have that plan. And this is one of the things. Again, you have to you shape yourself and build yourself around the geography you have and the history you have. And this made sense. Now, this is the part of geography which is getting definitely into the human range, because population management, population organ, all can have effect on your military. Do you recruit from a specific group of people? Do you recruit from a certain class? Do you open your officer class up to a large number of people? One of the interesting things about England, I do specifically mean England, but also to an extent Scotland, but their military history is to an extent different, is that even during the 100 Years' War, at the very beginning, there's a guy called Sir John Chandos, who's a knight, who's often put in charge of quite major operations, even though he's only a knight. He's not a lord. And some of the lords don't like it, but the kings don't care, because he gets the job done. And that's a whole history when it comes to population. If you know there's an ability for your family to rise, maybe in 1 or 2 generations, it tends to keep the good people in your country working and rising. If there is the possibility to rise to seniority, rise up in position, rise up in power and prominence. When there isn't the opportunity, that creates problems. That's often one of the reasons why you have more wars. You have more peasants' revolts. You have more issues with your middle class. Again, one of the interesting things we look at in history is when there's a lot of wars going on, a lot of royal families being thrown down, why did the similar movements in Britain, for example, not catch on like they do in other countries? There's often been arguments put forward of, oh, well, the British were inoculated by its own civil wars and those things. No. There's the fact that whilst there were problems, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying it was a brilliant place where everyone could rise. There was enough movement, enough support for movement, that there was a safety release valve. Now, I would argue that whilst if you look at this plague scenario, you'll see that there are places which are far worse hit during the plagues, again, than Britain. Britain, as a nation, always had the issue of sea travel. There's a finite amount of space in Britain, kind of similar to the Scandinavians. There's far more arable land, there's far more agricultural land than there is in Scandinavia, far richer agricultural land than there is in Scandinavia in most part, but it has similar motivations to head out to sea. And especially once you're talking about the infrastructure of the UK and movement of goods around the UK. Whereas once you start to look at the other countries, whilst there is certainly going to be a desire for empire, Spain, for example, whilst they have, for them, once they've have dealt with the major threats. The trouble is then they're running into the Ottomans. They start running into the Ottoman Empire, and they're quite strong formation. And you have the Habsburg-Ottoman Wars at various points. They're often concentrating on building an empire in Europe. Same with the French. And the Prussians, later much of Germany. But various others. Why are they not going further? Because it's the natural expansion point. You see, the thing is, you go for what you can. You only go for what you can't see. If you can't see, and if there's nothing you can see. You see, if you can go to your borders and see rich agricultural land that's just controlled by a different king, and frankly you don't like that king that much, you can expand. You'll go, right, and I'll beat him in a battle. I'll take the land off him. I have rights to that territory. Sure, I can manufacture them. But if you have a scenario where your people have got all the land you can see, well, once you're on board a ship, there's not much difference, realistically, in a 2-day voyage versus a 20-day voyage versus a 200-day voyage. If you're prepared for it, you're already on the ship, so just extra time and food. So geography and population has an effect on how you start to think about things, how you start to think about the world, and also how you start to interact with the world. It's kind of an interesting scenario you find yourself in when you start looking at this as a history. It also affects how you recruit your armed forces. You see, if you have a relatively stable population strength, you can afford to have a relatively permanent set of armed forces. But if your population is always going up and down, and therefore you need people to work in industries, to work in farming, etc., maintaining a permanent military can be problematic. If you depend on large trading fleets to go around the world, can you also afford to have a large naval fleet? It's both pulling from the same resource as sailors. Do you have enough sailors? So population and population specialty can have a really big impact on your military. Again, Britain has the advantage of being an island nation. That means, as a proportion of its borders, well, the sea makes up all of them. Whereas for other nations, they have land borders they have to secure. Vauban builds these wonderful fortresses, as well as developing the Vauban methodology of siegecraft, which basically makes him invincible in sieging and being besieged. He literally writes the textbook and enacts it on several occasions for the French. You wouldn't get a similar development in England, because, well, your policy is if the enemy land, you go for them and take them out as hard as you can, as quickly as you can. It's similar policy as the Romans controlled their empire. If in doubt, if there's problems internally, we go and deal with it. We have walls for the border, we have forts for the border, but internally we crush with whatever we have nearest as quickly as we possibly can. Because if you crush a threat early on, it can't expand. And a foothold made by forces can be expanded. It's easier to resupply than get the initial landing. It's far easier to justify, far less risky to do a reinforcement if you've got the initial area secured. So for dealing with slave revolts, for dealing with threats to the UK, it's a similar policy. Again, you want you want the standing force ready to deploy. It also affects the style of troops you need. If you've got borders, long borders, you're going to need cavalry. Far more. Far, far more. Because you want someone to be riding your border. Literally patrolling it. Because people on horse can patrol the border far more efficiently than people on foot. And again, that explains the force structures of what you're talking about. What's available, what these nations specialise in, and what they're going to keep as part of their permanent force structures. And those force structures are going to affect their approach to modern warfare. Again, why does the modern British Armed Forces have so many infantry regiments? Why is infantry such a big thing in British history? Because look at Britain. You want to go anywhere, you've got to deploy it by sea. What is the densest, i.e. easiest to pack in, military structure you can deploy by sea? Infantry. Think about it, they don't need a horse, so you don't have to have space and food and carriage for the horses. They self-load, so you don't need to crane them on. If you want to deploy a force around the world, or to deploy a force where you need to, in Europe or wherever, from your country as quickly as possible, infantry are the way to go. Specifically, light infantry. And that has been one of the reasons why the British has traditionally had this army. I know Fisher put it so colourfully as the British Army is a shell to be fired by the Royal Navy. It isn't that simple at all. But that has explained its structure for a very long time. The British Army has traditionally been built around being able to be deployed quickly and easily by shipping. That has been a guiding light for its force structure for a very long time. Whereas armies which didn't need to deploy by ship, which could deploy to their own borders under their own power, and had to deploy under their own power, often looked at, well, we'd like actually more horses, please. Conversely enough, that's one of the reasons why the British Army was quite so easy to modernise into a fully mechanised, motorised fighting force compared to the other nations, because it had had a lower proportion of horse units than others. Again, you can work through it. You can look at these countries, look at their geography, look at what the realities of their borders and defending their borders and where they're going to be fighting, and you can map out their choices in arm structure and why their forces are structured the way they are. Why do they have certain units? Why do they have units of mountaineers? Because they have mountains and they have borders on those mountains. If your mountains are all internal, Britain has mountains. It doesn't have mountaineering troops. It trains its Royal Marines in mountain and Arctic warfare because they are supposed to, as part of NATO commitments, operate in Norway. It also has the Gurkhas who come from the pool. But those are bonuses. They're not really part of Britain's strategic security, are they? Because where are the mountains on Britain's borders to fight over? Yet, if you're looking at France, if you're looking at Germany, if you're looking at Switzerland, or Austria or Italy, mountain warfare is a major part of their force structure, because it's a major part of their strategic scenario. So yeah, they have units which specialise in mountain warfare. And it's also because that's where their population lives. And again, it's their defensive depth. Their depth is those mountains. And again, as a nation state, you can argue, what are you there to defend? Your nation's borders or your nation's population? Well, to be honest, it's both. That's what you have to defend. And often where your population centres are going to be around where your greatest natural resources and interests are, so you've really got to defend them. So, stability. This is a weird thing to talk about when we start talking about cultural drivers of nations and militaries. But here's the point. I'm going to start off with a little bit of history, and these things are often caused by geography. You can have stability thanks to where you are in the world. If we consider in the Royal Navy's case, the Royal Navy's Overseas Patrol Fishery Protection Squadron has existed since 1481 as a continuous organisation. So, in simple terms, the Royal Navy has been responsible for UK fishery protection for, and this is recorded in 2025, so please remember that, 2025, continuously for 544 years. They've been carrying out the role in various points since 1379. That is during the 100 Years' War. Think about that. In the nicest way, there are many countries on Earth which have a shorter history than this squadron in the Royal Navy. That is stability. The oldest regiment in the British Army is in theory the Honourable Artillery Company, which traces its roots back to 1537. You know, it's just a tad younger than the Fisheries Protection Squadron, but you know, it's there. But the oldest continuously serving regiment is the Coldstream Guards, which have been active since 1650. 1650. The Coldstream Guards are a wonderful unit which I have a lot of respect for. I can also tell, having spent as much time with them as I have over the years, that they have been around for 375 years. Trust me, their mess collection certainly testifies to it. What is this? What are we talking about? Well, there's that classic phrase, which is sort of corrupted when Cunningham talks about it in reference to Crete. The Royal Navy's thing that takes 300 years to build a tradition, 30 years to build a crew, 3 years to build a ship. Often it's shortened to the, when he's talking about Crete, it takes 3 years to build a ship, 300 years to build a tradition. We will go rescue the army. The point is, the Royal Navy's had 300 years to develop those traditions. And this has an impact on your military formations. You see, humans are curious creatures. We can be driven a lot by our self-expectation, our self-image. Often one of the most interesting things that happens when you're talking about military training in any formation, whether that was destroyermen in the 1920s and 30s, whether it's the SAS and SBS today or anything like that. Passing the tests and being told you're elite, well, that means you start wanting to live up to being that elite. You have a mental image in your head of what that eliteness is, what is expected of someone in that role, and you start to live up to that. That mental image is created by tradition. That mental image is created by history, by the continuity of your force. And if you look at nations, they use this shamelessly. There is the reason why the British Army and other forces fight so hard to keep traditional names of certain units alive and kicking. Because those names carried on through history, those traditions come with a weight of expectation on the people who carry them. Why do they behave a certain way? Why do they not surrender? Why will they take on impossible missions? Why will they hold themselves to such a high standard through hell and high water? It's tradition. It's the weight of expectation on themselves. It's stability. One of the interesting things is when you talk to units like the Gurkhas. They are an organisation, a group of people who have developed almost a mythology around them in terms of their fighting prowess, a deserved mythology around them. With every generation, that mythology grows, and the standard they hold themselves is even higher. The fitness test they have to pass to join the armed forces whether they're the British, Indian, or other armed forces they join, are already very high. But then the standards they keep themselves to when they're in service, they're higher. What they expect of themselves, how they act, how they react, how they deal with threats, and how they protect innocence. That's all their tradition. It's a weird thing to talk about when we're talking about military cultural drivers in terms of a national scale and on militaries, but for a national scale, having this creates an almost quasi-religious perspective. Okay? That's the best way to describe it. It's a faith. It's a belief. It is something you have taken into yourself as a human and you will put out into the world. And it is also something that is often one of the scariest things to try and grapple with in terms of psychological warfare. I will say this when you're dealing with and confronting an enemy. A force which has this on their side is far more difficult to grapple with in terms of breaking down than a newly raised force. A force which doesn't have that history. Which doesn't have that weight of history on them. You can do it still, don't get me wrong. But the psychological warfare you have to apply in that scenario is almost different. In fact, in all that scenario, you almost try and give them a situation which looks like one of their historical feats, so they charge into it, reacting as they would as their historical counterbears did, because that's what's expected of them, and use it as an ambush. But that only works if they're really not paying attention, if they're really led by people who are going by instinct, not thought. And the whole point of having senior officers is they are supposed to take a step back and start thinking. Senior officers and NCOs are supposed to do that. That's why you have them. That's why they have get paid the big bucks. They have the responsibility of, in the middle of a mindstorm, when everything's going on, taking a step out themselves and going, hang on, what the frick is going on here? So, yes, stability. How long have you had stability for? What are you expected to do? What is your unit expected to do? How are they expected to react? Battle honours. I have spoken to people in the past who go, do they really matter? And I go, yes, they do. Ship names with battle honours really do matter when you're selecting a ship name. Battle honours. If you're selecting a warship which is named for an admiral, that's going to have an impact on it. Today, the current example in the Royal Navy would be HMS Duncan, which is named for Admiral Duncan, who won the Battle of Camperdown against the Dutch. If you talk to the sailors on Duncan, they will be able to tell you pretty much everything about that battle. I have met dozens of them over the time, and I've ended up having the discussion about Camperdown with almost every single one, because they find out I've studied a lot and taught it, and then they want to talk about it as well. Because it's what their ship is named for. And it's the standard they hold themselves to. It's the standard they think of themselves as. Secundus debisque rectus. Upright in prosperity and peril. That's their motto. And that's a fun motto. It's kind of a play on the fact that when his force was considering rebelling and was having issues during the various mutinies going on at the time, Duncan held one of the ringleaders over the side of the ship and asked if anyone was going to take his fleet from him. They decided against it. Duncan was a very tall, very, very tall Scotsman, who was also very big. It was the kind of, mobile meat mountain scenario. Now, the thing is, he was always famed as being a solid operator. He kept up He kept up the blockade, he kept up the watch, he kept his fleet together, and he fought the big battle. He did everything that was required of him. If you look at the Type 45s, which has been a constant go-to, there are two names which come up quite a lot. Duncan and Diamond. All the names in the Type 45s are pretty darn good. Please don't get me wrong. But Duncan and Diamond seem to come up an awful lot when it comes to operational needs. And it's well known how strong those crews are. And part of that is their heritage of their name. Part of that is what goes with the heritage of those names. And what they expect of themselves because of the heritage of the name. But I would say that all of the Type 45s have been, when allowed to be, have been fairly good. The trouble is they're a highly overworked group of 6, and they should have been at least 9 to 12. But yeah, someone decided to save money. But that's a whole other video which I've talked about enough times. It's amazing. You do all the research and development to get 12 units, and then in classic British government short-term thinking, they go, oh, let's save money, let's only build 6. Then they become £1 billion per unit on the programme, whereas out of programme costs and construction costs. Whereas if you built another 6, they'd probably cost between 7.2 and 7.8 billion, for the whole class of 12. Because the next 6 would have been that much cheaper to build, because all you're doing is ordering it over again. They're good ships. They didn't build enough. And then we have economics. Now, this is a cultural driver because it's kind of obvious. It goes with the resources from earlier. Now, this has been coming the whole way through. It really has. It's one of those topics which people often don't like to hear about, because it's annoying. It seems to pervade everything. I often see the debates about government being it's run by lawyers for lawyers with occasional advice from economists. Those who wish to help the economists, please don't apply, because they're not taking any options. And to an extent that is true, but in the UK it's more often not PPE, politics, philosophy and economics graduates. They seem to make up an awful lot of those who go into politics today. And that makes sense to an extent, because usually they do a course of PPE at university, then they go become a researcher for an MP or some form of usually agent, work as an agent or something, or work in the political parties, and then from there they get onto the selection lists, which each party maintains, and then they go do the tour of the country for the various seats which come up, and they'll be looked at by the local councillors and the local party chairmen, etc., and chairpersons. And they'll select the ones who they think fit them best. And then maybe they get elected. Maybe they get a good seat, they get elected, and there you go. They have completed their life cycle. They're now in the House of Commons. They can now work on seeing if they can achieve the full life cycle of getting to become a minister. That's the way it goes. There are variations. There are people who aren't quite like that. There are always people who claim they're going to break the wheel, but it never really works. It always ends up going the same way over long term. And that usually happens in countries because they develop into a rhythm. And a rhythm can become a rut if you're not careful, but it's a rhythm. Now, if you have, as I already discussed, resources, you have a better basis to go and get more resources. If you have stability, that gives time for people to make long-term investments in infrastructure, in things which pay off long-term, which provide for business growth and the growth of the economy in other ways. All these are very good things. for the longer term. And even a nice rhythm, like exactly being able to predict for business, being able to predict what the likely leadership is going to be, what their likely policies are going to be long term, is a relatively good thing. However, remember what I said about rhythm can become a rut. And a rut can make you presume that the future is always going to stay exactly the same. If we consider in this period, talking about world manufacturing output, that was the thing that mattered. The nations which had the greatest manufacturing output, they were the ones who were the true powers. They were the ones who were the really capable states. And also it depends on what their manufacturing output was. One of the interesting things is, as this time goes on, you notice that America's grows quite dramatically and Britain's sort of seems to change. But actually what you find is, as this period goes on, the British move up into higher and higher end manufacturing. Higher and higher end manufacturing, moving up more into more and more the technical research, tippy-toppy end of the manufacturing scale. Which is what Germany tries to compete with them of, and does sort of compete in. Whilst America takes over a lot of the lower level manufacturing. The more mass-produced, the stuff which requires a lot of space, but not necessarily a lot of skilled labour. Why? Because America doesn't have a lot of skilled labour at that point. They're growing it. By the time you get further on down the chain, especially after World War I, they developed a lot of the skilled labour. Admittedly, by the time we get to World War II, they've got less than 20,000 skilled labourers working in their shipyards nationally. But, yeah, things happen. Skilled labourers are expensive. Who wants to keep them going? But these days we don't measure countries' power necessarily by their manufacturing output, do we? We focus on their economic output, on their GDP. Beware of this. The reality is, though, if you do have a strong GDP, if you do have a strong economy, if you do have a strong manufacturing output, well, that can be helpful. That usually gives you a stronger military basis to work from and a more consistent supply for your military. Again, if you're a country which is often going bankrupt, you're not going to be able to keep your military forces going on a consistent level. You're not going to have, if you're a country which is often going bankrupt, forces which can trace their time back hundreds of years of active service. Which doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. So yes, economics are a factor. Stability is a factor. And to an extent, military power is a part of that. Naval, if you are able to stop problems becoming things affecting your own industrial, your own economic basis, your own scenario of your own trade and lines of communication, and that's often the good example from the Napoleonic Wars. Whilst the British are destroying French coastal trade as well as French international trade, relatively speaking, the French attempts, and they do make decidedly effective, decidedly concerted attempts on these fronts, don't achieve the same level of success. Why? Because they can't fund it the same way. For the British, as I've said before, naval power was what they had to have because, as an island, that was how they got everywhere. For the French, who have massive land borders, they have to think about their army first in Europe. Especially if the British tend to do what they traditionally do, which is use their economic prowess to hire another army in Europe. That also has problems with the French. They've been happy to hire the Prussians, the Spanish, all sorts of nations over the years. They hired the French to deal when the Spanish were a problem as well. They bankrolled the Dutch. It works. It's the viable methodology for much of this period. So, yeah, that's what you're dealing with. Economics has a factor. It's a cultural driver. And also, it's a cultural driver in terms of the economic level of your nation might well have an impact on who joins your armed forces. Are your armed forces seen as a methodology for rising up the social ladder still? Are they seen as a safe place for economic advancement, for economic security? Or are people joining them because they want a sense of adventure, because they want to serve, because they want to do something bigger than themselves? Or are they joining it because they have no other options? Because they don't fit anywhere else in the economy? All those are options. And those options are not mutually exclusive. But the percentage of your recruits which fit in each of those categories can have an impact on the quality of your armed forces. If people are there because they don't feel they have any other options, but they don't really want to be there, they're not going to be as good a set of armed forces, are they? Because they're not going to be as motivated as people who are there because they want to be, because they see it as prestigious, they see it as something which is worthwhile. If people are there because their lives depend on it, lives of their family depend on it, because of the economic circumstances, again, they're going to be very different. One group are there because they have to. One group are there because they see it as the foundation of their life, so they will hold on to it and professionalize as much as possible. Another group are there because the imagery, which means they'll be swept up in the emotion of it more. All these will have an impact on your military force structure. And a concerted impact. So there you go. There is a quick, and I do admit this was a quick. I have known people who teach this course, who take a full semester to teach this, to teach cultural drivers on militaries and how it affects. So we're talking many, many hours of teaching. Many, many hours of teaching. And this video is going to be less than 2 hours long. With that being said, I'd like you to think about your own nation's current militaries. And I'd like you to look at them and see what you think the cultural drivers are that are affecting them, how your nation's cultural drivers have affected them. What has this video inspired you to think about? Because that's usually where I start off with. When I have been involved with students doing this, I usually sit there and go, okay, take your own nation, take maybe another couple of nations, put them together, look at their armed forces, and from their armed forces, try and look at what their stats will create, what things will create that kind of armed force structure. And then look at the nation and see if that holds true for their cultural drivers. And if it doesn't, ask why. Usually the answer is, if it doesn't hold true, is they're imitating someone else. They're imitating a close ally, or they're imitating a alliance structure where they are fulfilling a certain component of it. That can be particularly compelling and particularly problematic. Example being, of course, the British Army of the Rhine, which makes very strong sense in terms of the Cold War political paradigm for NATO and the British government's approach to it. But the underfunding of the other services in comparison to make it work doesn't make sense. That puts them in a problematic position. And that's what we're dealing with to an extent as a legacy to this day. With that being said, thank you very much for watching. I hope you've enjoyed. Hope you found it interesting. After this video, which comes out on the 20th, we've got Leadership of Liberty, which has actually been spun round with RN's views on US carrier task force. So that's what's coming out next week. And then we've got Collingwood after Trafalgar coming up. That's going to be a good one. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed, and take care. Thank you.